Hello, everyone, and thanks for listening. So I ran two articles actually. So this is one of the two. It it's pretty lengthy, so I'm going to try to read most of them. So it goes on to say comparing the Irish to African American slaves is prejudice. The Irish as slave meme promotes a racist agenda. And so if you see on this card here, a lot of this is on Facebook, Twitter, Pinterest, on social media when people are in groups where they talk about politics and they talk about racism in the US. And so the meme, it is usually promoted by people from the alt-right and from like maybe nationalist groups, white nationalist groups, that white Irish slaves were treated worse than any other race in the US. And when is the last time you heard the Irishmen bitching and moaning about how the world owes them a living? And so that is why the title here says comparing the Irish to African American slaves is prejudice. And so it's by a Gardina Pestana. She's the contributor, and she's speculating widely equates to the enslavement of millions of African Americans in the Americas over the US, many centuries with the experience of Irish immigrants, laborers. So stating that the Irish were enslaved as well. So this supposed connection is intended to suggest that many other groups have suffered in the past, and therefore African American experience slavery, racism, and marginalization has no particular claim to our empathy. So basically, you shouldn't really feel sorry for African Americans because other people were enslaved or went through harsher treatments. And it's basically to justify a lot of the perpetuated the discrimination and the marginalization and segregation, and it's to justify cases towards a group of people, to not feel any empathy or sympathy towards them, and to compare them with others. Two, the meme hints that Irish overcame their oppression, therefore African Americans should as well, and the descendants of Irish Catholics in fact blend into American society, coming out to drink and parade are indisguisably from the most white Americans, are indistinguishable from the most white Americans. So why can't African Americans do the same, basically, is what they're saying. So this effort, it's in bolded, it says, in quotes, this effort is to equate historical experience of two very different groups, and doesn't hold up well under the scrutiny. So like many sloppy historical arguments, especially those conveyed in shorthand memes, this effort to equate the historical experience of two different groups doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. So the Irish, along with other immigrant groups, suffered from prejudice and poverty, of course, but they took low-paying jobs and lived under horrific urban slums and face harassment from those in large societies or larger societies who resented their presence and their differences of language and religion. And yet the Irish flooded in the US voluntarily as immigrants and refugees driven from their homes by famine and poverty, and they were never kidnapped or captured to be marched in waiting ships, forced, chained, and into noxious holes, transported and auctioned off on auction blocks to be sold to the highest bidder into society that denied them of the most basic legal protections. Irish children belonged to their parents, not to slave masters who could sell them and rape them and beat them to death without facing any legal consequences. So anyone with a smattering of accurate historical information knows that enslaved Africans face conditions indefinitely worse than those confronted by Irish immigrants. Anyone with a smattering of accurate historical information knows that enslaved Africans face conditions in infinitely worse than those that confronted Irish immigrants. History through memes exploits pre-existing prejudices as well as widespread ignorance, as the Irish-African equation makes clear. The Irish experience in America does have a better modern parallel, however, today's Muslim community in the US. So the Irish who came in the 19th century entered a largely Protestant nation with a long history of suspicion towards Catholic or Catholicism, and many largely Protestant nations with a long history of suspicion towards Catholicism. Many Americans viewed this strange faith as foreign and threatening. They did not see the Irish as fellow Christians, but as members of the international religious organization dedicated to tyrannizing um, over the control and over controlling its members, or tyrannizing. And so they thought that the Pope was evil, and they believed that he controlled Catholics in ways that made it impossible for them to become legitimate citizens in the U.S. Anti-Catholics thought that the Irish would not blend in, and they would always be Catholic first and American second. These fears prompted the terrible treatment of these immigrants that the meme of enslavement invokes, even as it's misrepresented. So just like the Irish in the 19th century, Muslims currently live in a society that thinks of them as an alien presence. So although the U.S. is no longer predominantly Protestant, many still think of the U.S. as generally Christian and Islam, like Catholicism before it, as outside acceptable boundaries. As a result of these views, Muslims face suspicion, fear, prejudice, and violence. Many non-Muslim Americans look upon them as perpetually foreign and as people who can never be assimilated. Peaceably working Muslims or peaceful Muslims are trying to make a life in the U.S. and facing ignorance and prejudice make closer parallels to the Irish. And like the Irish, so in other words, they're saying that Muslims are probably more what you would want to use as the parallel to the Irish rather than African Americans, because African Americans, what it says here, white supremacists equate African slaves with Irish immigrants as part of their effort to diminish historical experience of Africans in the U.S. And so it goes on to say that, and like the Irish, they are in fact perfectly capable of making homes in the U.S. and contributing to American society in the numerous positive ways. So this is the paragraph where they were talking about Muslim Americans. So the Irish as slaves meme promotes a racist agenda. It plays into that white supremacist view of that an American minority that has recently come out into the open. So white supremacists equate African slaves with the Irish immigrants as part of their effort to diminish the historical experience of Africans in the U.S. So basically, they don't want to be held accountable for the historical and marginalization and discrimination and racism and murder of African Americans, and all of the struggle that African Americans have faced throughout the U.S. and still even to this day. So promoters of this agenda, uninterested in historical accuracy, would see no value in the meme equating Muslims suffering at the hands of the ignorant, prejudiced Americans today and the Irish of yesterday. Yet, such a meme would offer a better parallel, although in some circles unwelcome history lesson. So it talks about this article right here about how people will use this whole meme as an argument to justify why you shouldn't feel sorry for African Americans. And so I also took the liberty of looking at this other article, which was the first one I actually really saw before I saw this article, and I'm reading it. It says, "No, the Irish were not slaves too," and this is under the Pacific Standard article. And so this is a historian named Liam Hogan who has spent the last 6 years debunking the Irish slave myth. And so this is an older picture, and it's showing a scene from the Irish wake in circa 1750. And so call it fake history whenever people on social media start talking about slave reparations, race, and internet trolls will jump up and demand, what about Irish? What about the Irish? So they use that as the argument, of course. So over the past years, the myth of Irish slavery has been found fertile ground in the internet memes as a way to derail the conversation about historical complicity for white folks in the slave trade or the need for affirmative action today. So basically, it's a way to not feel sorry about what has been done or what is still have been done to African Americans. So the Irish escaped from slavery to general inclusion and prosperity, if they did, if they escaped from slavery and general inclusion and prosperity. The false and racist argument goes that African Americans can do likewise. So fortunately, whenever this claim starts to get traction, a librarian from Limerick steps forward to debunk it. And so Liam Hogan, who works at Limerick City Library in Ireland, he's well known to his 30,000 plus Twitter followers and readers as a passionate and informed voice working against the myths of Irish slavery, while never erasing the complexities and nuance of the history of Irish forced labor. With St. Patrick's Day nearly here, which it is here, Pacific Standard caught up with Hogan over a series of emails to discuss his work and the pernicious nature of the Irish slave myth and what we can do to counter this false narrative. So it goes on to say, how did you get started debunking the Irish slave myth online? Around 2012. He said that Nina Rogers' groundbreaking book, Ireland, Slavery and Anti-Slavery, which looked at Ireland in the context of the Black Atlantic world and racial slavery in colonial America. She concluded that these European slaveocracies had a major impact on Ireland. And on a local level, I was stunned to discover that Frederick Douglass spoke in Limerick, or Limerick merchants attempted to set up a slave trading company in 1784. So it was a surreal feeling to discover that the 18th century building that I worked in was built by Philip Roach, and that it was the most successful provisioner. He was the most successful provisioner of the British West Indies in Limerick. So I then set out to explore Limerick's historical relationship with slavery, racial slavery, and began to publish articles from an Irish perspective. I noticed that most of the popular comment below one article was a piece of propaganda full of basic errors and false equivalences that suggested we were slaves too, and I soon realized that this was a copy and paste which was proliferated all over the web and social media, so it needed to be challenged. So what is the reality about the history of Irish unfree colonial labor? So while the majority of the Irish people who became indentured servants in the colonies did so willingly, why they felt they had to do so is, of course, another question. A not insignificant number of were forcibly deported and sold into indentured servitude. This peaked just after the brutal Cromwell conquest of Ireland, when there were orders given in multiple countries or counties to round up and deport those who it claimed could not support themselves. Indentured servitude was more insidious than simply a case of labor exploitation. Let me read that again. Indentured servitude was more insidious than simply a case of labor exploitation. A 4 to 7 year indentured to serve out bond, servants' lives and movements were subject to control and dominance by their masters, even outside of work hours, with punitive restrictions placed on marriage, locomotion, and pregnancy. So there were both voluntary and involuntary servants. What's the difference? The laws were the same. Both were treated as servants and had a predetermined length of time to serve before they were freed. So in Barbados, the customary length of time to serve in the 1650s was between 5 to 7 years. But in 1661, a new law that was introduced reduced that time to between 4 to 2 years, which was even much, much shorter to be in servitude before you were free. And that wasn't the case for African Americans, of course, right? So you didn't have the choice of servitude for a number of years and then you're free. It wasn't like that. And we didn't voluntarily come over to the US, not the way they had, explain it here. So this custom was altered by the colonial administrators to attract servants to migrate to their colonies. And it was also used to single out the Irish when they were not wanted. So in 1655, harsh laws were passed in Virginia that targeted Irish servants who arrived in the colony without indentures. So these terms for adults were 2 years longer than those that were applied to other Christian servants, and 3 years longer for those that were under the age of 16 years of age. But in 1660, there was a restoration. The law was repealed. So meanwhile, you're telling me that some Irish people profited directly and indirectly from Caribbean slave trade? So here we go into something else, which this is usually the subject that becomes a shocker to people who are uninformed or don't know about history. Yes, absolutely. It goes on to say in Ireland, it was mainly indirect by way of provisions trade. So it primarily benefited Protestant ascendancy, the Catholic elites, and the Catholic middle class who dominated trade in the cities. So many of our merchants, whether Catholic, Protestant, Huguenot, or Quaker, made fortunes trading with all of the slaveocracies in the Caribbean. So shoes for enslaved people were manufactured in Belfast, and as many mainly poor Irish Catholic tenants were forced off the land to make way for livestock, butter, beef, pork that were salted and exported into colonies in numerous quantities by way of Cork, Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick. So these provisions, especially cheap in Ireland, were essential for the operation of slave labor camps, as their constant supply meant that all the majority of the land could be used solely for crops or cash crops like sugarcane. So Irish peasants lost their land to make way for cattle, which was exported by Irish landlords to feed enslaved people who didn't grow food or their own because the land was too valuable for making sugar. And then presumably Irish people bought sugar and rum. So yes, the provisions exported from Ireland fed slave servants, overseers, and the planters, herring, pork, beef, butter, and so on. And one cut of beef exported out of Cork was known as planter's beef. And in the other direction, a flood of slave-produced goods were sold in Ireland. Sugar, tobacco, etc. So every newspaper in Ireland in the 18th century carries adverts or advertisements of sugar from Barbados, Jamaica being sold by a local grocer. So in 1770, the Irish market absorbed nearly 90% of Antigua's total rum exports, and in 1774, Dublin imported 108,821 gallons of rum from Antigua. So many merchants and colonies paid for their Irish provisions and slave produce. So were the Irish people more directly involved in slave trade, or were there Irish slavers? Navigation laws ensured that a monopoly of English and Scottish slavers existed, of course. So some Irish sailors migrated to the slave hubs like Liverpool, Bristol, and Nantes and became slave traders themselves. So an example of this is David Toy. So from Tralee, the County Kerry, he settled in Liverpool in 1750s and captained at least 4 slave trading voyages from 1766 to 1771, and by 1772 he had made enough money to become a slave ship owner himself, and he was the part owner of the 10 Liverpool slave ships from 1772 to 1786. So for many Irish diasporas, profiteering was direct through slave ownership and employment as an overseer. So there were in fact slave masters who were Irish who were involved in slave ownership and employment as being an overseer. So my survey of the slave schedule suggests that slave owners with recognizably Irish surnames owned over 110,000 slaves in the US of 1860. So there you have it. So given all this, why has the myth of the Irish slaves lasted so long? Firstly, I think we need to be precise about what it is we're labeling a myth and not throw the baby out with the bathwater, of course. But the Irish slaves myth that we contend to with today is relatively a new manifestation, approximately 2 decades old, and refers to the drawing of a false equivalence with racialized, perpetual, hereditary chattel slavery and or refusal to delineate servitude and slavery. All of the exaggerations and fabrications are secondary to the core mythos that slavery was slavery in 17th century Anglo-Caribbean. So, but the concept of the Irish people being enslaved in the Caribbeans and Cromwell forces is contemporary with the events themselves and is based on the historical truth. This is why I have also always referred to it in quotes as a way of separating the past or separating the present day propaganda from its use by Irish people who describe it as slavery in a general sense at the time. The challenge is this discourse is identifying what slavery means in the past and in the present. Can we blame the English? So Cromwell's Irish slaves are a canon in Irish nationalist historiography. It is rarely explained that this slavery was in the form of involuntary indentured servitude for a fixed period of years or time. So you see, it referred to all down the line from James Connolly's Reconquest of Ireland, 1915, which claimed over 100,000 men and women and children that were transported to the West Indies and were sold into slavery, to Daniel O'Connelly's speech in Mallow in 1843, when he asserted that 80,000 Irishmen were sent to the West Indies to work as slaves. But these were rhetorical claims based on truth, but greatly exaggerated for effect, that are not to be confused with historical accuracy. So here is a certificate of freedom, but in terms of an Irish person that was in servitude. So this certificate is of freedom dated June 5th, 1838, demonstrates that the Irish convict Francis Neal has completed 7 years of obligatory labor in the penal colony of the New South Wales, Australia. So as an Irish pub musician, I think a lot about the sense of belligerent victimhood in the 20th century Irish culture. Is a part of what is going on, of course. So there's a selective memory about who we identify with in terms of the colonization of the New World. So there exists this sense of that the complicity with imperial projects was individualist rather than connected to any of the notion of Irish identity. So post-independence, a line was drawn by nationalists that everything that had happened prior to this was to be laid at the door of the British Empire. So it's, of course, a bit more complicated than that, and as one might expect in the past colonial state. So our national story is presented in a linear history, a journey from bondage to liberation. So this explains why some Irish people express shock when they are in fact informed of many of our kin were, say, slave owners themselves in America or involved and benefited from dispossession of indigenous people and the lands across multiple continents. So the cognitive dissonance that follows often leads to the knee-jerk response. Were they really Irish though? So that's sort of the thought that people of Irish descent have, is like they're shocked to hear that they had kinfolk in the past that were also involved in the slave labor market. So and actually catapulting most of it, and owned slave ships and were overseers and masters themselves. So the deeper problem here is that we don't admit the complexities in our past, how we were going to confront it in the present. So I'm thinking of Magdalene Lundry's the mother and baby homes, or the vivid memory of anti-Irish discrimination existing alongside a collective amnesia of the fact that anti-Semitism was once an official part of the immigration policy. So is your relentless online debunking having an impact at all? This is a person questioning the author and the person that's from the library in Ireland. So I think at this point I can say, after 3 years of labor, that it is working. So in other words, people are actually reading the articles about the historical involvement of Irish slave traders. So this is immeasurable to the extent that my fact checking has caused mainstream publications to retract articles, of course, based on bogus sources from um, memes that he's targeted. So basically, when this person has seen memes, he basically challenges the memes, and he has went and dug through history and research, and he's basically put it right here in an article in a short form, which this article is probably long to you that I'm reading, but it basically debunks all those myths. So I hear from people all the time about how useful this has been. Seems to be especially appreciated by those who use it as a go-to resource to help people who may be sharing propaganda without realizing ahistorical, damaging, and intensive, and how intensive it is. So basically, that's that whole article in a nutshell. So um, a lot of times people will use different memes, and it's in shorthand. They get bits and pieces of information, and they really don't have the foundation. They just basically grab, like, it's like how people use the Bible. They take pieces of scripture and then they twist the scriptures to fit their narratives or their agendas, basically. And so this is I thought was an interesting piece to read. So I just thought it was something that should be worth talking about, especially since it's supposed to be St. Patrick's Day weekend, and a lot of people are uh, looking at um, some of these things that come up on social media, and when people will argue with topics on race and history. This I thought was very fitting for this weekend, of course. So with that being said, thanks for listening.